Hello and welcome to Thikana's US election special, brought to you live from New York. I'm Nader Rahman. And just like that, it's over. While the election results have yet to be officially certified, the nation has decided Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. Across the next 2 hours, we will try to understand how and why this happened, while also taking in international perspectives of how the election was viewed from around the world and what it means for Palestine, Mexico, and Bangladesh. To help us discuss these issues, today in the studio, we have Sri Srinivasan, the CEO of Digimentors and the president of the South Asian Journalists Association. Joining him is Samira Asma Sadiq, a Bangladeshi investigative journalist who has reported in New York on immigrant communities, the pandemic, and misinformation for the New York Times, Washington Post, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera. With this esteemed panel, I'm going to start off with, I think, the question that's on everybody's mind. Did you expect this? Whoever wants to go first.
I did.
Yeah?
I did. I think perhaps some of it was that I was a little more cynical after the way that it was treated in 2016, which is, we didn't really grasp the full extent of what now President Donald Trump would have, kind of his reach. And also I think there was this idea that people who were voting for him, we weren't fully aware of their values. We thought that, he has crass language, he has, these kinds of comments, and we thought that most of America would be against it. But I think this time around we had more data to work with, that we knew that no matter what he says, no matter the rhetoric, it's not going to change people's minds.
And Sri, would you say you expected this result?
I feared this result, but I didn't expect it because I was hopeful. We saw that this was really close election, right down to the wire. Everybody said that it was, but you cannot help but step back and look at this as not as close at all overall. And this will be seen as a mandate that he has been given to do the things he has promised. And to do the things he's promised means those things, we have to look at those things very carefully and pay real attention going forward. This is not an election that affects the US. This is a global election.
I think that's very well put, and I'd like to put forward what I think, I was speaking to Samira just before we went on air, what I think is maybe a slightly provocative take. In 2008, Barack Obama was the candidate of hope and change. The two big words that have come out of almost every exit poll this time was that the electorate wanted a change, and the people who voted for Donald Trump are hopeful that he will bring prices down, that he will help their lives. Is it fair to say that in 2024, the candidate for hope and change is actually Donald Trump?
Well, he's also the candidate who claims to be for Muslim people. This is the distorted reality we live in now, where Donald Trump was able to say that, and that has to be put on the shoulders of Democrats, that was allowed to happen. I think that we are seeing a moment where these changes that half of America is voting for, half of America is worried. And one thing to note is that if this election had gone in another direction, all of us would be bracing for some kind of civil war with people who wouldn't accept the election results. Look at what the Democrats are doing. They will accept the results. There will be no fear of violence from that side. So what does that tell you about the side that won?
Yeah. And Samira, would you say he's the candidate of hope and change?
Absolutely. I'm not saying my hope.
Sure, of course. It is an important distinction.
Right?
Yes, yeah.
But just going back to the Muslim voters, right? He not only did he say that he's on their side, there are a lot of Muslim voters who are receiving that, who believe that, who have voted for him, right? If you look at Dearborn, Michigan, I was really surprised to see a lot of Muslim voters or Arab voters who are supporting him. I had a conversation with this group called Bengalis of New York. Sorry, not Bengalis of New York. My apologies. Bengalis for Trump. And one of their biggest points was that we are supporting them. We are supporting Trump because our values are aligned with his idea of religion and the importance of faith and family, right? And you know, it's you have to see where that's coming from.
Sure,
right?
sure. It is interesting, and this is not a critique of their opinion and their thoughts, but like they say it's aligned with their values, but his values are also deeply, as he speaks to a Christian right, which honestly doesn't have a lot of space for many other religions to practice their faith and to be open and free in the practice of their faith in this country, let alone how they view minorities in other countries. So this idea that this, can you tell me more about the conversation? What else did they say to you?
Some of the others was just, you know, the economy and prices coming down, which we've seen among a lot of voters. But I think it's important here to note the difference between rhetoric and reach. He has spoken, you know, we've seen his rhetoric about the Muslim community, we've seen his rhetoric about Arab communities, but there was a lot of reach from his end to Arab communities, which Kamala Harris had not done, right? Like when the DNC happened, we knew that like a lot of Muslim leaders felt that they had been rejected, they felt invisible, and at the same time, I've read reports of Trump reaching out to Muslim and Arab communities where folks are or leaders, right? And I think there's a difference between what they're hearing versus how they're being seen in front of Trump, right? And
That's it. Could you articulate that a little bit more? What they're hearing and how they're being.
Right, because it's not, at the end of the day, if you look at it, right, like if they're asking Kamala Harris for a meeting and they're being rejected, but they're asking Trump for a meeting and he's at least saying, yes, we'll see you, right? That is a moment of feeling seen. That is a moment of feeling less invisible, and that is a little more tangible than what you've heard him say at some rally or something, right? Does that?
Yeah, it does make sense. Sri, do you think you could speak to this topic just for a little bit? Because it did seem like for the longest time, the Democrats were the party that were out there on the ground, shaking hands, taking meetings, not saying no to anything, to meeting everybody who wanted to meet them. But if some communities, and specifically in places like Michigan, and we're talking about minority communities in, let's say, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, if they feel like they weren't even being heard, can you blame them for saying, I want to vote for a person that at least hears me? Is that the failure of the Democratic Party?
Well, you know, this is a man who did a Muslim ban once, and there's no reason to think he won't do it again. This is also a reflection that Kamala Harris could, you know, we kept hearing this line, which I think is right, that she had to be flawless while he could be lawless.
Yeah, that's a good line.
Think about the things that she was able to do. She did not pick Josh Shapiro, who was the governor of Pennsylvania. That might have helped her win Pennsylvania, but he's an ex-IDF soldier. How would that have gone down? She got no credit for the things she did do, and all the blame for things she wasn't able to do. She did not, she put daylight between herself and President Biden on a variety of issues around Gaza, around Palestine, that had never been done in that way before and wouldn't be able to be done today, but she got no credit for that, but got blamed for all the things that the perception was there. I think we also have to know that this is a very unusual moment with Trump, that he could say and do anything. He told us that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and I will not lose a voter. In fact, I think he was wrong. He would gain voters if he shot someone on Fifth Avenue. And so in that context, it's very hard for someone who's a more traditional candidate to run. So I blame partly misogyny, racism, but also things that happened that we weren't accounting for, that young men would turn out in such large numbers inspired by Joe Rogan, Elon Musk. These are celebrities that are as powerful as Beyonce and Taylor Swift. Young men don't vote in elections, conservative men, but they did.
Sri, I'm going to offer some pushback over here. You've just named three things that happened, you know, like but you seem to have put blame on everybody except the Democratic Party. And I think this, at least for me, at least in my understanding of it, this is the problem that happened in 2016. This is the problem of analyzing what happened in 2020 when it was only 120,000 votes across 5 states, the narrowest of victories. Forget the popular vote, the narrowest of victories, yet it was hailed as something transformative. So, but because I do accept your I do accept your criticism of these, of let's say Trump and like of Elon Musk and Joe Rogan and understanding their importance and how people are misogynistic and all of that. But at what point in time, not that you are a Democratic Party operative, but at what point in time can the Democrats actually look at themselves and not write a book like Hillary did in 2017 that said, you know what was the Comey email that did it, without understanding that maybe not going to Michigan was why you lost Michigan? When will the Democrats have that moment? If this isn't the time, I'm under the impression it never will be.
That part I agree, that the focus should have been on doing even more, but she ran a campaign that, in 100 days, imagine, this is historic, what she was able to do and how close she got. But the forces of this moment.
How close she got? As it currently stands,
yes,
she is going to get blown out.
That's what I said. I said this is a mandate. I absolutely said.
But she didn't get close, though. I guess that's my point. To frame this as being close.
What do you think would have happened if Joe Biden was the candidate?
But now we're going into whataboutism, right?
No,
But I'm saying it wasn't close. Right now she's down by 5 million votes. It seems like the Electoral College will end at him at 320. This wasn't close. I don't think it's meaningful to frame this as being close, at least in my opinion, because there's a huge amount of daylight between the votes she got, the mandate that he got, and for us to continue to frame it as close, I do believe, this is my take, it gives Democrats an out. This wasn't close. This was a blowout to me.
Well, in one sense, you're right about that, but also keep in mind that this was that moment, the time that he was shot. He himself was shot. And that was framed. America loves those kinds of stories.
Sure.
And that helped. He's able to say anything and do anything. All the stuff that he has said and done would have ruined any other candidate. So she was fighting forces that no candidate could have overcome at this time. And my message to Republicans and the Republican Party is, yesterday he said it is a time for healing. We have seen nothing in the 9 years that there's a man who cares about people who don't support him. Even his own supporters, even his own vice president people were calling for him to be hanged by his own supporters.
Yeah.
So if I want to see him fix the problems in America that he pointed out, but we'll also say that the perception that the economy was the only reason is because voters believe that. Because they see the price of things and believe it. But would you believe that The Economist, which is a conservative publication that supports Ronald Reagan and all things Republican, they said if we had a vote for this economy, we'd vote for Kamala Harris?
Sri, thank you for that. We're going to go to our first guest today. You talked earlier about having a global perspective because this election doesn't just affect the United States; it affects the rest of the world. And joining us now is Palestinian journalist Abir Ayub. Hi, Abir. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Abir, when I last spoke to you, I said we might not know the results today. We were talking about razor-thin margins. Here we are. The results are in. I'm interested. What does this mean for Palestine?
So the results is out and Trump is back to presidency. I have been following reactions from Palestinians this morning, and I wasn't surprised that they weren't surprised or excited for anything, because people say that what they want now and what they care about is for the war to end. They witnessed, Palestinians and Lebanese as well, they witnessed the Democrats for the past 4 years and how they were dealing with the war, and obviously they failed to stop the war, and there was an ultimate support for Israel to defend itself. Now we have Trump back again. The thing is that we know Donald Trump and we can expect what he can present to the Middle East because he was there before, and we can see that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is saying that this is the greatest coming back in history, which means that no one forgot like the changes Trump did during his term and the support that he gave to Israel in terms of adding more more power on territories and lands to the Israeli power. And now we have the Israelis in Gaza. So this can be a part of what can come next. But in terms of how Palestinians are feeling, I would say they would have felt the same if Kamala Harris won the election because they are not optimistic this war is going to end soon.
You know, that's a stark reality. Reality check you've given us over here. On the ground, people in Palestine feeling disheartened and distraught by whoever wins this election. I'd like to put forward, I guess this is like a difficult thing to say. When Donald Trump said he'd end the war, he said he would end the war. He did not explain to us how he would end the war, because there is a version of this events where the way Donald Trump ends this war is the complete and utter destruction of Gaza. And then at least he can tell his people and the people who voted for him, I ended the war. That possibility, I don't mean to say it in light terms and like to a Palestinian journalist, but like, what do you think about the possibility of that happening, of ending the war being the complete destruction of Gaza?
Yeah, Gaza is destroyed already. I mean, it has been more than a year, and the neighborhoods that were not destroyed are not very many. Today, as I speak, people are evacuating Beit Lahia and Beit Hanun in northern Gaza Strip to other parts of the Gaza City. The destruction is still going on. Trump said he would end the war. He's been more direct, he's been more clear about what he wants, but he's not given details of how he would end the war. I don't think it's because he doesn't want to tell. I think it's because it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell how this war is going to end while Israel is interested in having military presence in both Netzarim and the Philadelphia corridor. At least from the reports we are seeing, how the American interests and the Israeli interests are going to meet. This is what we are going to know in the next few months. But I think that Trump is being more clear and direct about what he wants. Analysts believe that Trump might work on separating the Lebanese front and the Palestinian front because the Lebanese is easier in solving. Also because it's mainly about Gaza. Like the war started because of Gaza.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to tell how he would end it, but he's been clear about what he wants.
This idea of separating the fronts, do you think, is your analysis, is your take that the Lebanese front will end first and it will end quickly? And do you see it happening? Do you see it happening without him actually even taking up the oath in office on the 20th of January? Will there be changes in this interim period between the election and the 20th of January? And potentially, would the front in Lebanon be ended by then?
I wouldn't be surprised if the fronts were separated. I wouldn't be surprised if the war in Lebanon ended first, because the war in Lebanon started as a support to the war in Gaza,
Yeah.
as a support to Palestinians in Gaza, and that was made loud and clear by the former head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. It was to support the Palestinian one. That doesn't mean that Hezbollah would necessarily keep fighting until the war in Gaza. And especially that you have other parties in Lebanon. You have the government, you have other parties who want the war to end. You have the Lebanese people who want the war to end because they are hectic. The economic situation in Lebanon
Dire.
is
Yes.
is collapsing. You have many factors that can lead to the separation of the fronts.
And to zoom out for a second, the last time Donald Trump was in power, his son-in-law basically brokered peace between Saudi Arabia, between other Gulf states and Israel. How important was that in terms of allowing this current war in Gaza to continue? How important was that work that he did in 2017? Did it affect what happened last year?
Well, it's a matter of priorities. I saw reports this early morning that economic side is a priority to Donald Trump, and if it's economic or economy in the Middle East is a priority for Donald Trump, who's better than the Gulf countries
Yes.
to make deals with, right?
I have to ask you, is there not even growing displeasure? What is the view of the Gulf states from Palestine?
Well, it's different. It's not only the Gulf countries, it's the Arab countries. People think that the people in Gaza think that the Gulf countries and the neighboring countries could do more to stop the war. They could do more to prevent the war to go on in a second year. But at the same time, there are deals made with Israel. There are normalization agreement that made with Israel. So it's complicated. But yeah, the general feeling in Gaza that the Gulf countries and neighboring countries could do more to prevent the war.
I'm going to have one last question. I'm going to make this a quick question and a quick answer from you. Do you, by any chance, see any of this spilling over into the West Bank? Do you see something expanding over there if the war in Gaza is ended? Do you see another front being opened up? A quick answer from you, please.
Not really a second front. I see huge changes can happen in the West Bank in terms of settlements, in terms of adding more lands from the West Bank to Israel, because that was the highlight of Trump being in power.
So what you're saying is hopefully there will not be another war front over there, but the settlements will increase, and all of that work that happened under Trump, the expansion into the West Bank, that'll just continue.
Yeah, as I said, we know what Trump can do. We can expect because we had him 8 years ago in power. He moved the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem. He added more spaces of Golan Heights to Israel. So if that was made before, people in the West Bank expect, and also political analysts expect that some parts of the West Bank can be subjected to such,
annexation. Yeah. Abir, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on here. Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to her. Thank you. Folks, there's a lot to take in. That really is a lot to take in. Samira, this idea of this being a global election, all US elections are global elections. Not one of them is simply about the US people over here. The direct result of what happens over here affects lives, people on the ground, women and children in Gaza, in Palestine. And there's so many people here of Arab descent in states which specifically, as you spoke about Michigan earlier, that we're not quite sure. I think we kind of understand a trend of how they voted. But what would you make of, let's say, a non-vote for Kamala Harris or a vote for Donald Trump. How would you interpret that?
That's a good question. You mean among the Arab
Yes.
voters
Yeah.
specifically?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think a lot of it is kind of what Abir said, right? About with Trump, people knew what to expect, right? With people, they not only have they seen him over 4 years, but I think when October 7th happened, people eventually thought that at some point the Democratic Party might become a little, might show more support for the Palestinian community. And when that didn't happen, when a lot of folks felt unseen, that's when they decided that it's not her, right? Which is kind of like more of a revolt, right?
Sure.
And I think one of the biggest differences that I saw / read, heard between Trump supporters and Kamala Harris supporters is that people were voting for Trump out of hope, which is why I think that, or out of loyalty.
Sure.
Whereas people who were voting for Kamala Harris was out of fear.
Yeah.
A few people will say that they're voting for her, right?
Yeah.
They're voting
I think
for
maybe the most committed voters. I think there was a
Sure.
profound movement amongst women, amongst some groups of people who were just like, I'm voting for her, right?
I think even the women part, right? Like abortion was and she really
Yeah.
capitalized on that, right?
Yeah.
Like abortion was like such a huge issue, and you could even see that among a lot of mainstream reporting. But that's what I mean is that they would have done that for another Democratic candidate.
Okay.
With
So
Trump, it's like you are the person that we want. And when I'm bringing up the Bengalis for Trump community, right? There is also, of course, they're interested in what he stands for or like what he plans on doing, right? But there's also a sense of who he is. I'm just going to mention this briefly and we can come back to it later.
Yeah.
Something that was really intriguing that they said is they compared Trump's victory to the student movement in Bangladesh that happened earlier this year.
Wow.
And they said that's right, exactly. And I think that was the most intriguing thing for me, and I asked them. I said that Trump is his campaign, his journey is very top down, whereas the student movement in Bangladesh was very bottoms up. How are you comparing? And one of their biggest thing was that he fought all these like opposition, like he really stood up against like everything that came for him.
Yeah.
So I think there has to be something that has to be said about like voting for a specific person versus voting for anyone who would have protected abortion rights.
Sure. Okay. Sri, can I get your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we saw this ability for people to be attracted to him.
Sure.
Certainly played a role. We also have to note that what is going to happen here is these mass deportations are going to affect disproportionately people who voted for him, including Latinos, including Muslim Americans, including I was talking on Indian television today, and I pointed out that a lot of Indians are very happy about this election result, but India constitutes number 2 or number 3 in the number of illegal border crossings of the United States. Guess who's going to get rounded up there and what's going to happen? I spoke to a Muslim family from Pakistan today, and I asked them, and they said, we all voted for Donald Trump because we know he's going to help Imran Khan. And so they're projecting. You heard about projection of the student movement kind of parallel. Here, they believe that he is going to help Imran Khan get out. They say that he's going to stop the war in Gaza. They're very upset about Gaza, but they believe that.
All of what both of you have said is groups of people that you've spoken to, and we're going to try and broaden this, seem to have put this kind of revolutionary seal on him. And that is an interesting way to think about him. I think I don't necessarily see it that way, but for different groups of minorities to see him as the revolutionary leader who will help them in their cause and are willing to not care about some other issues, then they become kind of single issue voters potentially, but single issues that are global, that are international, but not so much that are local to their lives over here. That idea that an immigrant voter, I think it's a wonderful thing, because as we keep talking about, right? The election is for the entire world. But to link that to, I'm so interested in this Pakistani family that you spoke to link it to the fact that Donald Trump will try and get Imran Khan out of jail. it feels like a lot of people have put their hopes, dreams, and aspirations on him, whether he wants that or not. And they're projecting onto him what they would like.
Yeah, and we've seen already some of the people who are very happy with Donald Trump in India, for example, is because he has said things about minority rights in Bangladesh, specifically about that.
Yes.
And so people aren't necessarily connecting these dots. I think that if you read Project 2025, which is going to be the playbook, you're going to see that a lot of the things that Bangladeshi Americans care about, minorities in America care about, are going to be upturned, overturned. We're going to have a Supreme Court that's now 6-3, is likely to be 7-2. We're going to see Justices Alito and Thomas replaced by younger men and women in their 40s. That's going to have generational impact. This isn't, hey, let's check out what happens for 4 years. This is going to be a generational election. If he wins the House and the Senate, we're going to see there's no checks and balances. The United States is built on checks and balances. A divided government is a good thing. You saw that India was expecting 400 seats for the BJP. Divided government. People were expecting France to go a certain way, pull back. But America has gone all out. One thing to say about women voters, and is America ready to be led by a woman? We've seen countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, India, Mexico, UK, all of these countries, Norway, have been led by women. But American men, to them, when they hear women saying, Kamala Harris saying, we won't go back, that they don't see themselves in the we. They see themselves as somebody else. So they like where America is. And you know, when you think about the difference between conservatives and liberals, I always try to explain to students is that a conservative believes that everything is okay. The systemic ways in which this country is built, its politics, its infrastructure, its medical system that can make you bankrupt because of one heart attack, those are all fine. And therefore, they don't want change in that sense. So when Donald Trump says, we'll make America great again, my question is, which America? Was it when there was slavery? Is it when there was Jim Crow and racist laws? Which part was where America was so great? And we know, I think, your audience knows better than anybody that America has a history of interfering and intervening. We're talking about all these things in the Middle East. It starts with America in 1953, and what the CIA staged was a coup in Iran. That resulted in everything you see here. So I was struck by a video I saw this summer of somebody saying from Singapore, if Biden wins or Trump wins, we all lose. That is true. America will, whoever wins, America will be its domineering country. But there is a difference among who wins, between the two people who win. Ask the Iraqi people if Al Gore would have been a different president. We were told there's no difference. We were told there's no difference between Hillary and Donald Trump. Think about how the world would have been different these last 9 years. So as we go forward, I think institutions need to be held to account. I think I believe that he's sincere for a moment when he says he wants to heal at that moment, but he's going to be surrounded by people who do not want to heal.
And if I may just add to that,
Samira, we will check this up in a second. We have,
as you can tell, we're all processing.
Exactly. As we have Laura Carlson joining us here from Mexico City. Hi.
Thanks for the invitation.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for joining us. So Laura is the director of the Americas program at the Center for International Policy. Laura, I spoke to you 2 days ago before the election. Well, this happened. It was maybe for some people a little bit unexpected, for some people quite expected. What do you make of it? What is the Mexican view of this election so far?
I guess it's not a complete surprise, although the degree of support for Donald Trump, including the popular vote, including flipping the Senate, we still don't know what happens in the House. I think that outpouring is surprising to many. In Mexico, it's a grave concern. We talked last time about how the government itself is not going to come out, with a position on this because it has to maintain an extremely close commercial relationship and political relationship, geographical relationship with the United States. However, there has been a lot of response in the Mexican press. There's a lot of concern and speculation about what this will mean for Mexico. We're seeing the peso dropped, although that's just usually kind of a temporary thing, and it's not necessarily representing a long-term view of what will happen to the relationship. There's fear about the threats of tariffs on Mexican goods, and of course, the threats that have been kind of constant regarding interference and actual military interference in Mexico in the fight against the cartels, as well as what it means for Mexico economically and socially to receive mass deportations, which has been one of the major promises that Trump is now saying he will fulfill as he moves into the presidency.
Speaking of mass deportations, so I found out the exact name of the Return to Mexico policy. The Return to Mexico policy is formally called the Migrant Protections Protocol, which is interesting. You say you're protecting them, and then the protocol is to return them, right? During Trump's previous administration, this led to more than 65,000 migrants not from Mexico struggling to find temporary shelter in northern Mexico. So this is a real problem, not just on a human level, but for the government of Mexico, how the return to policy affects how they will house people, what they will do with them, what rights they have in Mexico. Could you speak to that for a bit?
Yes, of course, because this was a major turning point in the relationship between the Trump administration and the Mexican administration in when they imposed this. What happened, and it shows the relationship of the economic dependency to the immigration policies that Mexico's been forced to adopt, is that there was precisely this threat of putting a duty on Mexican imports, and that's when Mexican government caved and agreed to accept migrants being returned to over the Mexican border that are not even Mexicans. You know, we were talking at that time about mostly Central Americans. And so this was kind of a version of what Trump really wanted to do, which is called the third safe country, which means that I'm sure people who in Europe are very familiar with this, which means that immigrants, if they travel through a country considered safe, and there's a very problematic definition involved there, they have to stay there, and they're not allowed to even request asylum in another country, the United States in this case, because they've already found safety. Basically, that's the rationale of it. There's no considerations of family unification. There's no real considerations of just how safe that country is. There's some economic compensation for the country that receives those immigrants, but Mexico didn't even formally receive that. And so we had these border towns.
You're saying Mexico didn't even formally receive that?
No. They completely caved because since it wasn't a formal agreement like a third safe country, it was like, yeah, take them, you're taking them, you know, and they did. And so that's why there was no infrastructure, there were no human rights, there were no work permits, basically, except in some very rare cases for the people who got stuck there. And at the same time, they were closing off asylum. Now, it didn't really change that much in the Biden administration. And that's why that became an issue, because they actually got rid of Remain in Mexico, a bunch of court challenges and that. But they had so many programs that were similar to that, and that made asylum seeking so difficult that we still had that congestion. And now we're expecting an increase in those problems along the border.
And, you know, these increases along the problems along the border for 4 years. For 2 years when he was campaigning, and for 4 years when he was in office, he promised to build a wall. He promised to build a great wall, an amazing wall. It'll be built. It'll go all along the southern border. It didn't work out that way. The portions that were built were extremely expensive. They turned out to be very small. But then for 4 years, when Donald Trump was not the president, he continued the rhetoric of building this wall. And we're back to it right now, this time with unfettered access to, with basically the support of Congress and of the Senate for sure, potentially Congress, and all the levers of power in his hands. Do you think a wall will actually be built? And A, what does that mean for Mexico? And B, who will pay for this wall? Because he kept saying that that other countries would pay for it.
He kept saying that Mexico would pay for it, which was ridiculous. And if he controls Congress, he can get U.S. taxpayers to pay for it. And the irony of the situation is that the wall hasn't even ever worked. The wall is a symbol of exclusion, which is what apparently many people in the United States want to hear. They want to hear that there will be no more immigrants, that the country will be for white, native, and I don't mean indigenous, obviously, U.S. citizens,
Yes.
right? And so that's what it's become. I don't think that I think he'll downplay it because it's not feasible, especially geographically, geologically, in many senses. But the other reason is because it's always been a hypocritic proposal. The U.S. economy needs the cheap and rightless, that is to say, laborers without any rights because they don't have papers. They need that labor. And so they've continued to come out of over the border, and they will continue to go over the border.
Is there a fear now that the deportation that happened at the border are one thing, but now he's promised mass deportations, right? And he hasn't outlined how he wants to go about this. But is there a fear that all of a sudden deportations to Mexico will rise, not just from the border, but he might be putting people onto planes and buses from other parts of the United States and saying, what's the easiest place you can go to? How about we send you back to Mexico?
Of course, there's a fear. How feasible again it will be and to what degree it will be implemented is still up in the air. But Stephen Miller is a maniac, and he's in charge of the immigration policy and has been. They may have, as your guest mentioned, unlimited power if they have the judiciary in both houses of the legislature. And so there is a fear. And anybody who's watching can imagine a family where part of the members are suddenly picked up and taken to a foreign country they may not even remember. You know what that means, what that does, not just to the family itself, but to the communities and to the society itself. It could be a tragedy of immense human proportions.
And as a dual Mexican U.S. national, I wanted to ask you something about the militarization that he's promised to use. Now, he wants to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 and the Insurrection Act as he plans to deploy federal troops to assist in apprehending migrants. This would be on the American side of the border. But beyond this, you spoke of this lingering, not just militarization, I'm speaking of militarization, of potential military incursion about the drug war into northern Mexico. Is that a real concern, or is that just rhetoric from Donald Trump? Is that a real concern in Mexico?
Well, I think it's a real concern. It's been picked up by a number of conservatives in Congress as well. And he's such an erratic personality that everything is a real concern in terms of there's no like a rational way to separate discourse from what's actually possible that he might do. So that's a real concern, and there are 2 points here. One is sovereignty. You can imagine any country in the world to have a military buildup of the #1 superpower on a global level on your border, facing you for whatever reason, whether it's cartels or immigrants, is a severe threat. But the other has to do with the way that this politics of militarization has imposed militarization within Mexico itself. The National Guard, which is now part of the armed forces, has been deployed to stop immigrants as the United States does what we call externalize its borders to make Mexico take on its own immigrant policies. And that's caused a huge number of violations of human rights and of deaths here in Mexico as well.
Laura Carlton, thank you so much for your insight and your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are going through the gambit of issues that this country has to deal with, that this country is finding itself trying to navigate in this moment right now. And I think to get a Mexican perspective of what's happening on the border is just as important as whatever a US politician says about what they want to do on the border.
Can I just say that
Yes.
there was First of all, this conversation is so unusual that we have this international perspective. That's very good. We should point out that the checks and balances of the government that existed will be gone, but also even within his administration, there were people who stopped him. The defense secretary told us that he wanted to lob missiles into Mexico to take out the cartel. So there were people who were there to hold him back or to resign in protest. This time there'll be none of that. He's going to get 100% loyalists, and they're the ones who are going to say. So when people say that, oh, his fascism remarks, how can you say that? We are not saying it. John Kelly, his longest serving chief of staff, is saying it. General Milley is saying it. And therefore we have to pay attention.
Yeah. Samira?
I think you pretty much spoke to whatever I would have said. I do want to just note that kind of what Laura said about it being kind of similar under the Biden administration, and that's something that we saw kind of at some point when the children separation was going on at the border in 2018. And it wasn't that it was going on then, it was just that it was receiving a lot more attention at that point, right? So I think it's important for us to also remember that this has been an issue, the deportations has been an issue that's also like across different administrations. And the vilification of the community is what's different, right? Like when Trump says something like, oh, he's going to launch missiles into Mexico, right? Or calling them rapists. And what was the most recent one? You know exactly.
Along those
or,
lines,
not Mexico, but like for the reference to Puerto Ricans about
an island of
floating,
trash,
right? And the reason I know it's not the same, but like for a Trump supporter, a lot of it looks the same, right? A lot of it, and so under Trump, there's the rhetoric that kind of makes it a lot easier for a lot of his supporters to vilify these folks, right?
And this idea of vilifying folks is going to become even more pointed in this moment because the exit polls are out. We all have this information. This is what came back in one of the exit polls today, that Hispanic and black voters, increased numbers of Hispanic and black voters gravitated towards Donald Trump. Now, of course, we speak about both of these categories in a way that's taking away any kind of agency from subcategories within them. But for the sake of this conversation, for the sake of the polling, let's use this language of Hispanic and black. The Hispanic vote increasing for Trump, to me it doesn't make sense when maybe the people who will be most affected by his policies will be their fellow countrymen. Their father, mother, brother, sister, their family members.
This is something I was actually going to say right before you were speaking with Laura, is that talking about your family members, I have family members who voted for Trump. Right, and it's I think one of the biggest illusions that we have is that it's a very community-oriented voting among the immigrant communities, whereas it's not. It's a very individualistic voting, right? When you ask them things like, oh, but what about, how can you vote for someone who has such violent rhetoric for your own family or extended family, right? It's not that they hate their own family, right? But it comes more from a very individualistic perspective. And this idea of, oh, you're going to vote based on your community is, I think, something that we need to stop looking at it that way, right? And so, and going back to kind of what she said about, not what she said, but, this plan that Trump has about police like apprehending anyone who's supposedly an undocumented immigrant like on the road, right? How are you going to, if you're a brown person and you supported Trump in this, what are you going to do when you're stopped? Because the police is not going to know. You're not wearing a badge of undocumentation, right? Or a
badge that says you're a Trump voter. How are they going to know that?
Exactly. I actually recently came across this sheriff in like a really small town, I can't remember, who explicitly said, I am not going to save you if you're a Democrat. If you're a Democratic voter, right? So it's like, how are you going to know that? You're most likely going to look at someone who is a brown person, who's a Sikh, who's wearing a turban, or a Muslim person, whatever it is, right? So this idea that a lot of folks are supporting this, a lot of like Hispanic and Black voters, and from my understanding, a lot of South Asian voters, right, it just boggles my mind that you are open to being humiliated in public, but just to forward this very individualistic benefit that you think you're going to get.
I mean, the ideal of individualism seems to be baked into the story we say of the United States, right?
Yeah,
it is one of the defining characteristics of it. So in one sense, that both I understand it, but a more difficult way to deal with this is the vote is done. It's all over. We vote once every 4 years about this.
Right.
And then we live with the consequences, as Sri was talking about, for years and generations afterwards. So you make the vote, you voted on the 5th of November, but the outcome of that vote affects your life and your family's lives and everybody that you know for so long. And in the immediate aftermath of that, I worry about immigrant communities, and this is like a very specific complaint, and I'd like to hear from both of you about this. Immigrant communities in swing states in the United States being vilified by the Democratic Party, because that is what happened last time. Last time, a lot of different groups have always been vilified, and I think that's an easy way to not have to pay attention to one's own failures. But over here, they will be vilified. It has already started. How do they navigate that? How do these immigrant communities in these swing states that eventually the Democratic Party needs them to vote for them? If you vilify them now, how can you ask for their vote 4 years later?
Yeah, I think that we're going to see that happening. I think the best thing that happened to the Arab and Muslim community in this country is that the rest of the election wasn't very close. So that Michigan wasn't the reason she didn't win is not because of the vote in Michigan. That's a good thing for Muslims and Arabs, Christian Arabs as well, who would have been vilified and pointed out as that's the problem. We're now pointing at black men, all of these, but remember that she won a majority of those communities. Yes, the numbers have changed dramatically, but there's still the majority of almost every community that we're talking about voted for her. What about white women? White women are going to be affected by all these abortion and healthcare issues that have nothing to do with abortion. Just being pregnant is going to be an issue, as it has been already for some women. And these women have decided that it's better to vote because what has won here in part is the culture wars have won. That you are told that your daughter is going to be assaulted by a man pretending to be a woman in your bathroom is the narrative that's taken hold, when we know the numbers of those things that actually happen are so minuscule. And as a result, a community that is a minority, the transgender community, that is already so weak and so oppressed, we are not going to see any sympathy for them. And so many other sections of society. And when we tell our children, in Van Jones said in 2016, I went back and listened to him, he said, we say, play by the rules, be nice, care about people less advantaged than you. All of that is out the door because that is not what has won this election. What has won this election is that you push down and you hurt the powerless and you win. And winning is more important than the community, than the country. I want to see Donald Trump and J.D. Vance be the president of the United States and not just the people who voted for them.
I do want to add to that first of all, immigrants who are voting for Trump don't care about being vilified anymore.
You really believe that?
I do believe that. They don't. Do they believe in being? Do they care about being vilified by Democrats, by liberals? No, they are much more. I remember in 2020. So first of all, in 2016, voters in New York. I knew very little, very few vote. Actually, I don't even think I knew anyone who was voting for Trump at that point. In 2020, right after Biden won, in November, there was a Million MAGA march in Washington, D.C., which I covered. And, I'm just out there, very obviously a brown woman with an accent and a very Muslim name. Very open about the fact that I was reporting for a liberal outlet, right? Two things from that. One of them being the number of non-white folks I saw there, right? And you could tell.
That is.
It was.
It's,
If I
yeah.
recall correctly, I may have spoken with more non-white voters. A really big, a really big Southeast Asian community. There were some folks who were like, I was for Hillary, and now I'm for Trump.
Yeah.
And it was. I think that's important to know because Trump supporters have become more unapologetic over the years. There was a sense of embarrassment, shame, or even which is not there anymore.
And what you're saying is they can just be who they are. There's no longer are you saying the myth of the underpolled Trump voter, of the shy Trump voter?
Yeah, folks used to be embarrassed to say, and we all know a lot of white liberal, white leftist folks whose parents are Trump supporters, and I understand that. I think most communities have that. And I'm not talking about Trump support. I'm talking about in Bangladesh, a lot of parents of liberals will be supporting conservatives. I've seen that in India too. So that's normal, right?
Yeah.
But I think people are becoming more open about the fact that that happened, and B, now I'm also switching, right? And just to add a little bit, like what you said about, people are now more about, I want to see Trump and Vance in office, and kind of that whole help thy neighbor attitude, maybe not being as prominent, if I'm correct, is that what you said, right? That's the other thing, is that we also have to remember that Trump, it's a spectrum, right? The reason I brought up the fact that I was a brown woman with an accent, with a Muslim name in that crowd, is they had this attitude of like, yeah, but not like, you're a good immigrant. You're doing the good, you know what I mean? So I think there's that distinction.
There's something powerful in the fact that Vivek Ramaswamy was so important, was such a big Trump supporter this time, to see the voice like that, to see somebody like that, and like the narrative he's crafted for himself, successful business person, conservative, immigrant, I think it allows a lot of people to see themselves maybe in values that they didn't necessarily think they aligned with, but they see someone and they're like, oh, that could be me. Let me investigate this a little bit more. What do you make of that?
Oh, America is very famous for Americans for voting against their own self-interest. There's a very famous book, What is the Matter with Kansas? And people who will benefit from democratic policies will vote because they're worried about what they call the death tax, as if they're millionaires who are going, so that has always happened. And what I worry about is that we now are going to have 4 years of some really deplorable characters running this country. Vivek Ramaswamy, RFK Jr., who's going to bring back measles, bring back polio in this country. He's going to be in charge of the healthcare. Tulsi Gabbard is going to be having some kind of role to play. Elon Musk. These are folks who are going to be part of our lives every day and are going to affect the planet. Think about what we're going to do with the the climate emergency is going to be a hoax. Not true, we don't have to worry, even though we had successive hurricanes in successive weeks just a month ago. America's ability to look at itself, to learn, is almost zero, and that's the price we're all paying together.
Samira, quickly before we move on to our next Zoom guest, what have we learned in this election, specifically about, if you could give me one line, about the brown Republican voter? What's one big takeaway? Give me a big one.
It's being unapologetic because they see Trump as someone who speaks without any filters. That's exactly what they're saying, that he's a straight shooter, he says what he wants, we know what to expect. And if you think about it, going back to the part where the voters are unapologetic about, I'm voting for Trump, it goes with his persona, right? They see themselves not just in the party and its values, but in the man.
Yeah.
And they love their taxes are going to be cut. That's all they really care about.
Yeah, everybody wants their taxes to be lower. I think so many people in this country end up voting for the place that they want to be 5 years from now. I'll vote for a person right now. Maybe I'm opining over here. I'll vote for the person who will lower my taxes when I have $1 million.
Right. Exactly.
We're going to have to say goodbye to Sri. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for having been here today. Very tight schedule. Wonderful to have had you here. And we're going to move on to our Zoom guest. Joining us from Dhaka, Bangladesh, is Zafar Subhan, the editor of the Dhaka Tribune. Hi, Zafar.
Hi, Nader.
Zafar, we find ourselves here the day after the election. Is this what you expected?
You know, it's not that I didn't expect this. It's not nearly as much of a shock as it was in 2016. I think 2016, no one really saw this coming. Whereas this time round, the polls were all over the place. But you have the phenomenon of the shy Trump voter. I don't think anyone was really, was sleeping easy thinking about this. We couldn't really tell one way or the other simply because everything was going back and forth. But I don't think it comes as much of a shock as it did the first time round.
And Zafar, stepping back from the election itself and how it's viewed in the United States, I wanted to speak to you about what this means for US-Bangla relations. Can you give us your initial thoughts about where you think things lie in this very moment? What will happen? I'm going to ask three questions. How are things right now? What will the next 3 months look like till the 20th of January? And then what does that relationship look like after the 20th of January?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's no secret that the current interim government headed by Professor Muhammad Yunus was enjoying a great deal of support from the Biden administration. And a lot of that support, I think, had to do with the esteem which Professor Yunus has held in the Democratic Party. They talk about sort of Hillary land, and she may still she's still an eminence grise within the party. But you even saw at the UNGA he had a meeting with Biden. There's a very famous photo op, and it's very clear that his relationships in the US administration appear to be centered around the Democratic Party. It was, I think, President Obama who gave him his Presidential Medal of Honor. He's got a Congressional Medal of Honor. I think that was perhaps when Bill Clinton was president. So now, of course, things have changed. And of course, the joker in the pack is the fact that Narendra Modi has very good personal relations with Donald Trump. So that's kind of where things stand right now. We still have a couple of months before Trump takes office. My sense is that actually this will, even when he ascends to the office on January 20th, it's going to change policy perhaps less than people anticipated changing.
And why would why would you say that? What makes you, or why could that be the case? Why not listen to his good friend, as he called him, his great friend in India, Narendra Modi?
Well, I was going to finish. It's going to change US policy directly less because, in a sense, I think he's going to have a more important fish to fry. However, as you allude to, probably what we're going to see is he is going to then take more of a back seat and allow India to take a more assertive role vis-a-vis Bangladesh, which, of course, India has enjoyed in the past and has been restrained in the recent past. So I think there is that, which is something which we need to be concerned about here in Bangladesh.
And then, so you're saying the relationship will definitely be guided by his the relationship with Bangladesh will be guided by his relationship with India, and as it
I think so, and it's not just that. I mean, it's other things as well. You have a very active sort of Indian lobby in the US, and who have actually seen have been very influential. In the previous segment, you alluded to figures such as Tulsi Gabbard and Vivek Ramaswamy, who could be expected to play a serious role in the coming administration, and both of them are again very strongly pro-India. So this could certainly be a concern for Bangladesh.
Do you think that this interim government will be pressured right now because they've lost their kind of big support from the United States with the Democratic government? Will they be pressured into creating into calling elections sooner than they would have been?
I think it's going to be a factor, and one of the things which we were seeing even prior to this election result was that the general sense in Bangladesh was moving towards earlier elections rather than later, in any event. So that was really the trajectory we were moving even before. I suspect that this may accelerate the process. It remains to be seen what happens, but certainly what we're going to see is that the previous government, the Awami League, is going to feel very empowered, very encouraged. They will get their support from India, and they will be able to create a lot of problems for the interim government in the streets and elsewhere. And it could be that looking at that, Professor Yunus and the rest of the interim government, and indeed the other players who are involved, which is, to wit, you have the military, you have the student leaders, you have the BNP, you have other smaller parties, would think that in terms of maintaining that stability that Bangladesh needs, that the smartest thing would be to go towards elections earlier rather than later. So I think that may actually be the ultimate impact of this election on Bangladeshi politics.
What do you make of the fact that the BNP and their chairperson, they released a statement just a few hours ago saying, for the first time in a long time, because all of this time they've given the interim government space, they've given them space to grow, said, well, let's go through these reforms, let's see where we stand. As of today, for the first time, they're talking about elections and they want it soon. What do you make of that from the BNP?
They have talked about elections earlier, but of course what we have seen since August 8th is that the drumbeat coming from them has grown louder and louder. Initially, they were willing, at least in their public pronouncements, to give the interim government, a lot of time, and then slowly it seemed from what they said that space was shrinking. I think they are just, they've got their finger in the wind, they're looking around, and they are also very concerned. You see, when I talk to people in the BNP, it's not that they have any, and there are two issues. See, one, of course, they have an interest in early elections because they figure that the earlier the elections are, the better it will be for them. The later it goes on, then that'll give other political parties time to organize themselves. And so that is, of course, there's very sort of naked self-interest in them wanting elections as early as possible because they would be the primary beneficiary. Beyond that, however, one of the things which a number of people have said is that they're actually concerned about the interim government's ability to hold things down, which is actually something we have seen in the past 3 months. And I think this new election result is really going to only exacerbate that concern. So I think they're really concerned, that, what is this going to do? Will we see, a resurgent Awami League out on the streets? If we do see a resurgent Awami League out on the streets, how will this government be able to deal with them? And they feel that they are in a much better situation being a political party and assuming they would win any elections which happen, a democratically elected government to actually deal with that kind of opposition. So I think that is also part of their calculation.
It's interesting that you spoke about the Awami League, and I think it's maybe important to speak about them in terms of the U.S. election. The Awami League, this is undoubtedly a moral victory for them. But simply on the basis of this election, of the outcome of this election, would you say they are any closer to entering politics in Bangladesh? Or is it just simply a victory they'll take from afar that'll help them build momentum to create pressure?
Well, it's interesting. It certainly is a moral victory. And it certainly, I think what it may do more than anything else is it may hasten or accelerate the movement towards elections. Now, whether that means elections with the Awami League or without the Awami League is an entirely separate question. That said, it's important to bear in mind that both fairly senior members of the interim government as well as the BNP have indicated that they think that the Awami League should in fact participate in the coming elections, and that that at least among these constituencies the appetite for banning the Awami League, and you hear that proposal given by principally student leaders but also other smaller parties, is not there. So there are two issues. Whether this particular instance makes it more likely that the Awami League will be able to participate in elections which are upcoming, that's a tough one to say. But I certainly think it'll hasten elections. And my sense is that when all is said and done, we will actually see them in elections, because I think general consensus, except for sort of small pockets, is that, A, for elections to be credible, they do need to be participatory,
Yes.
and B, that banning political parties, even political parties which may be guilty of great atrocity, which certainly the Awami League has been if you look at its actions in July and August, is probably not the way to go.
I would like to next speak about the elephant in the room, what this election means for the Indian government and what it means for India's continued relations with Bangladesh. I think it's impossible to have this conversation without speaking about Donald Trump's Diwali tweet, where he talked about the persecution of minorities, of Hindu and Christian minorities in Bangladesh, and there was never a response from the government, from the interim government of Bangladesh to that tweet, was there?
Not an official one. I think there were various unofficial responses by various people who are either in the government or close to the government, but I don't think they responded directly as an official statement,
But
which perhaps was a misstep on their part. I think there are three things to bear in mind about this tweet. So the first one is that I think what we've actually seen, that it was clearly something which various Indian and Indian American groups had been lobbying for a long time. And I think the fundamental reason which Trump was persuaded to make the tweet was to shore up his Indian American vote bank. So it was really to do with domestic politics, and he did it right before the election to have maximum impact. So whether that is going to translate into anything policy-wise when he takes office remains to be seen. So that's the first point.
Yeah.
The second point is that they very specifically talked about the issue of minority rights. And this is, of course, in minority protection. And this has actually been the huge issue which the Indian government has kept on, and also commentators in the Indian media and the Indian establishment have really talked about. And there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation which has gone out on this issue. However, the good news for Bangladesh is that this is an issue which can be addressed fairly easily. First off, everyone, or most people certainly in Bangladesh, and I assure you the interim government, agree that we should be protecting minority rights in Bangladesh.
Sure,
so to the extent that that we think that there's actually no contradiction between what Trump has said in terms of wanting minorities to be protected in Bangladesh, what India has been saying, and indeed what we in Bangladesh want as well. We all want minorities to be protected in Bangladesh. So if what this means is that the government will need to step up its protection of minorities and make extra certain that, since this is a sensitive issue for our large neighbor to the west, that this is something we're going to put even extra emphasis on, that is actually something which can be done fairly easily, I would suspect. And I think a lot of messaging needs to go out around that. I mean, I think the problem here is that, there's been a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and we haven't countered that with our own messaging. But it seems to me that that is something which can be done. A third point, and this is interesting, because what really you have to ask yourself is, what is the Indian government's, what is the Modi government's game here? What is it that they actually want to see? Now, if they actually want to see a return of the Awami League, then then I think that presages big trouble for us in Bangladesh.
Let's be honest. I feel like they do want to see a return of the Awami League. They have supported them. They have supported them in every aspect across 15 years. And the Indian state, whether it's the BJP or not, they will always support the Awami League, because there are historic ties to it. They protect minorities, or at least that's what the rhetoric is, that they protect minorities. If we just take that for granted, what does?
I think the thing is, it's not a question of what they would want. I mean, of course, if you could wave a magic wand and bring the Awami League back to power, I'm sure that's what Modi and the BJP would do. But you also have to look at the practicality of the situation. I think there's a growing sense in India, perhaps, that this is really not something that can actually happen. Now, if they still think that that is something which they can make happen, I think we're in big trouble in Bangladesh, because then what that means is they are then going to be invested in destabilizing the current government. We're going to see a lot of instability instability and maybe much more violence, political and otherwise, in Bangladesh, which no one would like to see. What I hope is, and this is what I have heard in many circles of the Indian government, media, and establishment, that it's not so much that they are wedded to the notion of bringing the Awami League back. They are extremely uncomfortable with the current state of affairs in Bangladesh, where you have, let's face it, non-elected interim government. You do have, fairly opaque.
But could we say with wide public support?
With wide public support, but the problem with this current government, insofar as the Indians are concerned, is it is relatively unstable. It has different support bases in different power centers. You have Professor Yunus himself, you have the interim government, you have other political parties, you have the army, you have the students, you have the students out on the street. And I think India especially is extremely suspicious both of the student leaders and what their ideological loyalties may be, and of other smaller Islamist parties such as the Jamaat-e-Islam, but other parties as well. And they worry that in a situation where you have an interim government, that not enough control will be exerted on what they see as the sort of the Islamist elements within Bangladesh. So if that is their primary concern, they may well be mollified by election which brings an elected government into power. Now, for many years, the Indian political establishment has been allergic to the BNP, but it could be that now they figure that given the current situation, they will take that, compared to an interim government. And there seem to be indications. There have been a lot of high-level talks between the BNP and the Indian and members of the Indian government, which you never saw before. If that's the case, then that's not quite the doomsday scenario we have of them going all in to make sure that Sheikh Hasina and the Awami League come back to power.
And I'd like to pull it back to the U.S. elections again, right? In this interim period between here we are, November 6th and the 20th of January, we basically have 2.5 months. What do you see this interim government trying to achieve or trying to get past, or how do you see them working with what is essentially a lame duck US government right now? What can they actually get done between now and the 20th of January?
I think there's not a great deal that they can accomplish. And I think one of the perhaps missteps of the interim government is putting all of their eggs into the Democratic basket. I think they have 2.5 months to reach out to the incoming Republican administration to make their case as to why they deserve.
Do you have any information on the ground that they are making their case? I know the result is 12. It's 12 hours old.
Spoken with. I have not yet, and I mean, I think this is it's less than 12 hours. But I will say this: when I've spoken with with people in the U.S. Embassy, and this is prior to the election, they have always been very adamant. They said, look, even if Trump were to come in, don't anticipate great changes. So the official line, the official State Department line, or the official U.S. Embassy line is, look, don't expect that this is going to change things dramatically. Now that could just be a line they're feeding. That is certainly their official.
That definitely is the line they're feeding us. But I'm going to ask one more question with regard to international development agencies. The president of the World Bank is always appointed by the U.S. president. It's generally an American. The World Bank has promised a lot of money to Bangladesh, to this interim government. Do you see those deals being reneged? Do you see something changing over there? And do you see moving forward the relationship with the World Bank going back to frostier times?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, one of the things which many people realize about Donald Trump, and I think Shashi Tharoor, who is of all people has tweeted this, which I thought was very prescient and insightful, is that fundamentally, Trump is a transactional person. Yeah. Okay. And so, yes, he is ideologically and personally, he has this feeling for loyalty towards Narendra Modi, and we understand that the Indian lobby will be very powerful and influential in his administration. However, there is room for Bangladesh to say, well, this is what we can bring to the table, or what the interim government can say, which he doesn't really, the thing about Trump, which could work to our advantage, is he is not unduly burdened by a sense of loyalty to anyone.
Sure.
So if you can make the case,
Yeah.
and if you can offer him the deal which he thinks is his interest, there's no reason that he would not necessarily change his opinion and change his policy based on that.
Dare I say on that, I want to call it questionably hopeful note. We're going to bring this interview to an end. Thank you so much for joining us from Dhaka. Thank you for your insight. Thank you. And now joining us in the studio, we have the editor-in-chief of Thikana Digital Media, Khaled Muhiuddin. Khaled bhai, thank you for joining us here today.
আপনাকে অনেক ধন্যবাদ
জি Khaled bhai, any thoughts on what Zafar just said? বলেন।
আমি মোস্টলি
জি
জাফর সোবহানের সাথে সবগুলি বিষয়ই একমত
জি
কিন্তু ঘটনা হচ্ছে যে মানে নানাভাবে নানা দৃষ্টিকোণ থেকেই তো আসলে সবকিছু দেখা যায়।
জি
মানে আপনি জানেন যে রাশমনের মতো 4 জায়গা থেকে 4 আমাদের তো উদাহরণ আছেই, নানা জায়গা থেকে নানা বিষয়গুলি দেখতে পারা যায়। এখন এই সরকারকে আসলে ভারত কিভাবে দেখবে, এই সরকার মানে আমি অন্তর্বর্তীকালীন সরকারের কথা বলতেছি, যে অন্তর্বর্তীকালীন সরকারের সাথে এই নতুন মার্কিন সরকারেরই মানে যেটাকে বলে হচ্ছে সম্পর্কের যে ডিনামিক্সটা সেটা কিরকম হবে, আলাদা কোনো কিছু হবে কিনা সেটা এক একজন এক একভাবে দেখতে পারে। কিন্তু মানে সত্যি কথা বলতে আমি যেরকম পররাষ্ট্রনীতি বুঝি বা মার্কিন পররাষ্ট্রনীতি যেরকম হয়, অনেক বড় পরিবর্তন বাংলাদেশের জন্য সরকার পরিবর্তনের সাথে সাথে এটা খুবই আনলাইকলি। মানে মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের তো একটা বৈশিষ্ট্য হচ্ছে এরকম যে এইটা আসলে আমাদের সাউথ এশিয়ার দেশগুলির মতো না অনেকটা ক্ষেত্রে। মানে একটা লোক যে একটা ডিসিশন নিয়ে ফেলবে, একটা পলিসি চেঞ্জ করে ফেলবে, মানে অনেকে এটা খুব পপুলারলি বলে উদাহরণ দেওয়ার জন্য যে ট্রাম্প থাকলে হয়তো ইউক্রেনে এই যুদ্ধটা হইতো না। এখন ট্রাম্প থাকলে জনাব পুটিনের মনে হয়েছে উনি ইউক্রেন আক্রমণ করবেন, তো ট্রাম্প থাকলে কি ইউক্রেনকে গিয়ে বলতেন যে ভাই তোমরা চুপ করে বসে থাকো? বা অনেকে এইটা বলেন ট্রাম্প থাকলে হয়তো গাজায় যা চলতেছে তা হয়তো চলতে পারতো না। কিন্তু ট্রাম্প থাকলে গাজা চলতে পারতো কি চলতো না, আরেকটা অক্টোবর মাস আসতো কি আসতো না, এগুলি আসলে বলা খুব মুশকিল। ট্রাম্প থাকলে 4 বছরের যুদ্ধ হয় নাই, 4 বছরের মধ্যে 3 বছর তো কোভিডই হয়েছে, মানুষ তো যুদ্ধ করার সুযোগ পায় নাই। তারপরে হচ্ছে মানে এগুলি আসলে আমার মানে ট্রাম্প আসলে আওয়ামী লীগকে কোলে করে নিয়ে দিয়ে আসবে, ওগুলি কথা একটা টুইট দিয়ে আওয়ামী লীগের লোকজনের বিশ্বাস হয়ে গেছে। পারলে এখন মানে জাতির ঠিক পিতা না হোক, জাতির চাচা হিসেবে ট্রাম্পের নাম এইটা আমার কাছে মানে আমি ঠিক অতটা মানে অতটা আমি বিশ্বাস করতে পারি না। আবার দেখেন এই যুগে আইসা 2024 সালে আইসা আমরা ব্যক্তিগত সম্পর্ক আবেগ ইমোশন দিয়ে আমরা নিজেরা কথা কইতে পারি আসলে, কিন্তু রাষ্ট্র সেভাবে আসলে পরিচালিত হয় না। নরেন্দ্র মোদীর সাথে আওয়ামী লীগ সরকারের বা শেখ হাসিনার একটা সম্পর্ক থাকতে পারতো, সম্পর্ক আছে, কিন্তু নরেন্দ্র মোদীর কারণেই নরেন্দ্র মোদীর ডক্টর ইউনূসের সাথেও একটা সম্পর্ক করেই থাকতে হবে আসলে। ডক্টর ইউনূসের ক্ষেত্রেও ব্যাপারটা সেম। উনি যখন রাষ্ট্রপ্রধান সরকার প্রধান, উনার পছন্দ অপছন্দের বাইরে বা পলিসির বাইরে, তাও বাংলাদেশের ক্ষেত্রে আমি আবার বলি যে বাংলাদেশের ক্ষেত্রেও হয়তো পলিসি ডিপেন্ড করে। শেখ হাসিনা হয়তো ওইরকম একটা সরকার ছিলেন, উনার মনে হয়েছে যে আজকে চীনের সাথে তার ভালো সম্পর্ক, কালকে ভারতের সাথে তার খারাপ সম্পর্ক, পরশুদিন তিনি ইসরায়েলের নাম পাসপোর্ট থেকে তুলে দিলেন, এরকম যাইটা সেটা করতে পারতেন। কিন্তু আসলে মানে যারা খুব মানে একটু হইলেও গণতান্ত্রিক দেশ বইলে তো আসলে ওরকম ভাবে আপনি মানে পড়ালেখা জানা মানুষ, আপনি অনেক যুক্তি দিবেন, ওই যুক্তি দিয়ে দেখাইতে পারবেন যে আমেরিকা আসলে অত গণতান্ত্রিক দেশ না, গণতান্ত্রিক হলে এই 2 লোক দাঁড়াইছে কেন। আমি সেইটাও করছি না, গণতন্ত্রের ফ্যাসাদ পড়ে থাকে মনে হয় যে দেশগুলা, সেই দেশগুলো চেষ্টা করলে তাদের মানে আন্তর্জাতিক পলিসিতে রাতারাতি কোনো পরিবর্তন আনতে পারে না। যে আমার আজকে চা খায়া মিষ্টি কম হয়েছে মনে হলো, আমি একটা পরিবর্তন করে দিলাম। আমি আজকে মাছ ধরতে গিয়ে মাছ ধরলাম না মনে হলো, আমি পরিবর্তন করে দিলাম। এভাবে হয় না আসলে। সো আমি খুব বড় যে শিফট ওয়ার্ল্ড পাওয়ারের কি হবে না হবে, শিফট হবে কি হবে না, অ্যাটলিস্ট ফার্স্ট ইয়ারে কি হবে, এটা আমি দেখতেছি না খুব সামনে চোখে যে মানে আমেরিকার ইউরোপিয়ান পলিসিতে বড় কোনো পরিবর্তন আসছে সেটা দেখতেছি না। বরং যেগুলি নিয়ে এইবার কথা হয়েছে, ব্যালটে যেগুলি কথা ছিল, মানে ধরেন সেটা ইমিগ্রেশন পলিসি নেওয়া হোক, আমাদের স্বাস্থ্যের ক্ষেত্রে ইন্স্যুরেন্স কতটা থাকবে না থাকবে হোক, এই সাধারণ জনগণ খুব বড় পরিবহনের সুবিধা পাবে কিনা, ওগুলির ক্ষেত্রে কিছু সিগনিফিকেন্ট পরিবর্তন আসতে পারে। ট্যাক্সের ক্ষেত্রে অবশ্যই ট্রাম্প একরকম ভাবে ট্যাক্স চিন্তা করেন, বাইডেন একরকম ভাবে চিন্তা করছেন। সো ইন্টারন্যাশনাল পলিসির ক্ষেত্রে আমাদের আসলে একটা ওয়েট করতে হবে। আর এই প্রেসিডেন্ট ইলেকশনে এই টাইমটায় আপনি যেটা বললেন, মনে করেন 6 নভেম্বর থেকে 20 জানুয়ারি পর্যন্ত, এখন তো তারা আসলে ট্রাম্প নতুন করে সুটের মাপ দিবেন, বাইডেন তার বিদায়ী স্পিচ ঠিক করবেন, কতটা আস্তে হাঁটবেন তিনি সামনে দিয়া, তারপর হচ্ছে স্টাফ বাছাই করবেন নিশ্চয়ই ট্রাম্প, অথবা তার মনে মনে বাছাই করা আছে, বাইডেন আরো কেমনে কোন দিক দিয়ে তাকাইলে তাকে একটু সুন্দর লাগবে, এগুলি দেখবে, এইগুলি নিয়ে আসলে বেশি ব্যস্ত থাকবেন। এখন আসলে খুব পলিসি খুব বেশি কিছু হবে বলে আমার মনে হয় না। সো উই হ্যাভ টু ওয়েট, মানে জানুয়ারি 20-তে উনি ওথ পড়ার পরে তারপরেও আরো 1-2 মাস দেখতে হবে যে বড় কোনো বদল আসতেছে কিনা। সো উই হ্যাভ টু ওয়েট।
I just want to say 3 বছর যুদ্ধ করার সময় ছিল না। On point. No, I've been feeling this and I'm so glad আপনি এটা বলেছেন। As Zafar was saying this, it occurred to me that, the interim government being so new, actually there is a lot of potential. Not a lot. There is potential.
Okay. Yeah.
There's potential to redefine what this relationship could look like, right? I was thinking about it as I heard him speak, that actually what would it be like if Awami League was still in power, right? I feel like I have definitely forgotten that.
Yes.
I was very ready to forget that. But given that this is a fresh new space, I wonder what it can do to like maybe entirely redefine a relationship with the U.S. And what he also pointed out is Trump is very transactional, right? Which we tend to forget. We're like, oh, he's racist. He's racist when he needs to be. He's Islamophobic when he needs to be, right?
Yes, when it suits his purposes.
Absolutely. Like when he wants to build relationship with Saudi Arabia, he will do it, right? So I think that's very important to remember. And also looking at that, so is Modi, right? We have to remember that when Sheikh Hasina left Bangladesh, there was that time when we weren't, it wasn't as much as we would have felt that it would be an obvious way that he would be receiving her. That didn't immediately happen, right? So if you like do the trickle down thing, there is room for this to become a bit more transactional. And also,
and can this interim government and whichever elected government comes after it, can they use this transactional nature of Donald Trump to their advantage, or will we always operate, in your mind, through a relationship of to an unequal relationship, one of fear?
It depends on what he wants, right? Like that ultimately that is what if he is like, do I actually think he cares about the religious minorities in Bangladesh?
No.
And also were religious minorities safe under Awami League? No. The people were burning, people were slaughtering cows outside temples, Hindu temples during Durga Puja, right? I will never forget that. So it's kind of like what is he using at what time, right? And the reason I bring that up is that he's kind of setting up the stage for using religious minorities to eventually make it a thing in Bangladesh if he has to, as kind of like a bargaining chip. He has to use it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Our next guest, who'll be on in a few minutes, he'll be calling us from New Delhi. So we're going to get an Indian view of what's happening over here. But to forget India in the relationship with the United States is basically, apni bulletin, you called Trump আমাদের কি জাতির পিতা? No, exactly.
আমি অবাক হব না, মানে যদি এখন এরকম হয় যে ট্রাম্প এসে আমাদেরকে উদ্ধার করবেন, এটা ট্রাম্পের একটা টুইট দেখে বোঝা গেল যে উনি সংখ্যালঘুদের অনেক পছন্দ করেন, এই সরকারকে অনেক অপছন্দ করেন, তাকে খুব ওয়েলকাম জানানোর জন্য ব্যবস্থা করা হচ্ছে, আবার কেউ কমলা হ্যারিস নিয়ে ঢাকায় মিছিল করছেন, আমার মনে হয় না যে সেটা সেরকম হয়। আর আরো একটা বিষয় আমি যেটা বলতে চাই, যে আমার আগের কথা সূত্র ধরে এবং আমার সহবক্তা যিনি আছেন তার কথা আমি সূত্র ধরে আমি এটা বলতে চাই যে আসলে আপনি যখন প্রশ্ন করেন যে আমরা বাংলাদেশে ট্রাম্পের মানসিক এবং মনোজাগতিক এই অবস্থাকে মানে ব্যবহার করে এই সরকার বা তার পরবর্তী সরকার এটাকে কাজে লাগাতে পারবে কিনা, আমি এইটাকে দেখতে চাই হচ্ছে এরকম করে বাংলাদেশকে আসলে ঠিক করতে হবে যে ও আসলে কি চায়। মার্কিন যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের সাথে এখন আমেরিকা তো বিজনেস করবে, রাইট? আমেরিকা তো চ্যারিটি করবে না। এমনকি ও যখন চ্যারিটিও করে, এটা ওর বিজনেস, এবং এটা ও লুকায়া করে না, কিন্তু ও কিন্তু রামকৃষ্ণ মিশন খোলে নাই। ও হচ্ছে বইলাই করে যে আমি এটা তোমার সাথে বিজনেস করতেছি, ইভেন চ্যারিটি ইজ বিজনেস ফর দেম। তাহলে আপনাকে তো আসলে ঠিক করতে হবে আপনি আসলে কি চান, এবং আপনি কোনটা অনুসরণ করতে চান, কোনটা কি করতে চান।
We'll pick up on that point after we hear from Samar Khurshid in Delhi. Let's see if Samar is with us already. Samar, thank you. 2 days ago, you were in the studio with us. 48 hours later, we have a new president here, and you're calling us from Delhi. Give us a lay of the land. What are you hearing from? What are you hearing in New Delhi? What do they think about the election of Donald Trump?
Well, it's a pretty significant development because Donald Trump and Prime Minister Narendra Modi have had a pretty good relationship in the past. They've expressed their mutual admiration. Modi was among the national leaders to very early on congratulate Trump when the results were coming in, and they're looking forward to sort of rebuilding that collaborative relationship. It's India and the US are big trading partners. They there's tons of revenue to be made between the two countries, and India is also it helps the US limit China's influence in the region, while also its acts. India has a good relationship with Russia, not so much with China, obviously. Has a great relationship with Russia. We buy most of our military equipment from Russia, but at the same time, we also have a great relationship with the US. And because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has created some complications for how India is dealing with the US, with the West at large. So with Trump coming into power, that might ease a little bit. Trump has, expressed his admiration for Vladimir Putin. He wants to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. We don't know how, but he wants to bring it to an end. So that might help also ease the tension that India has faced in pursuing its own national interests as far as it goes to, continuing to deal with Russia at an economic level, at a diplomatic level.
And so the election, of course, it's got to be fantastic for the BJP. Any idea what the opposition in India? Have they made a statement? What they say? I mean, they can't. After you.
So I mean, I'd say I haven't seen anything from the opposition. I might be wrong, but I haven't seen anything yet. There's a tendency, I'd say, among Indian politicians not necessarily to comment on, or at least negatively comment on other countries' elections. Now for Modi, as you said, for Modi, this is going to be a boon. One of the things that the Biden administration was more willing to do, which they just did recently, I think last month, they designated India a country of particular concern when it comes to violations of religious liberties. And Trump, Trump, I think.
It's funny that you say the Biden administration did this about about minority rights in India, and then Trump's Diwali treat says that about Bangladesh, and it brings out no mention about India and the kind of horrific ways Muslims, Christians, and other minorities are treated in India. So that's a sea change between those two ideas.
Yeah, and Trump, as your other guest said, is very transactional. So he'll say what suits his purposes, and he very assiduously wanted to court the Hindu American vote, and is why his tweet about Bangladesh was a very clear attempt at reaching out to that constituency. The Modi government, its record on violating the rights of minorities, particularly Muslims, the oppressive policies that Muslims have faced, that's not something that's going to receive much criticism from President Trump, who in his first term, instituted a Muslim ban and has surrounded himself with people who are suffice it to say, not friendly towards minorities.
No, of course not. And in terms of this relationship with India, I think you brought up a kind of a very important point about the increasing, and it is bipartisan, the bipartisan fear of China, both from any democratic administration, the last few, and this administration. How do you think India will be? What kind of an actor will India play between the United States and China now with Donald Trump at the helm? What role will they play?
Well, for one, Trump has been heavily critical of Chinese manufacturing and how that's taken away jobs and revenue from the U.S. Now, India versus China manufacturing is an issue of its own. So if he's going to try and strengthen relationships with India, I imagine on the economic front, that's one issue that'll definitely come up. Especially when he last visited, when he was president, when he visited, one of the main things that they wanted to focus on was a big trade agreement. That didn't get done then, but they did. India agreed to buy military equipment from the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. Was it nuclear submarines? I've actually forgotten. I might be wrong. I might be wrong about that. No,
I think it might have been missiles.
Missiles. Sorry.
But yeah. A greater Indian influence in generally in the South Asian subcontinent will also work to check China's influence in this sphere.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it's something that the Americans that's something the Americans, as you said, no matter who's in power, Democrats or Republicans, that's something they want to rely on.
Yeah. And thinking about this, we heard from Samira earlier, who's a panelist over here. She said that when she spoke to some people, they were talking about, in fact, I'm not sure who said it, was Samira or Sri, that it was Sri who said it, basically, who said that he spoke to some Pakistani Americans over here, and they voted for Donald Trump because they think that Donald Trump will help get Imran Khan out of jail, right? So that's I'm not going to say it's a flight of fancy, but like,
Yeah.
What is the Indian view of how Donald Trump will deal with Pakistan? What those relations will look like?
Well, probably they're probably expecting a more robust, sort of strong hand towards Pakistan. I mean, they've seen the way Trump has acted towards again in his own self-interest, in the U.S.'s national interest. He's the way he has taken on the way he's spoken about, acted towards other Islamic states, and I doubt Pakistan will be any exception to those kinds of, sort of blustery actions.
And I'm assuming I'm making an inference over here, and this will be to the advantage of the Indian government.
I mean, material advantage, who knows? But any, maybe reputational advantage, and under Modi, any slight towards Pakistan, I guess, to them looks like a victory for India.
It's a victory because it can be painted as a victory in your own press, right? And I am also interested in. We've heard about the top level, the government view. What's the word on the street? What's the average person? What do they think about this election? Because let's not forget, right? The Indian American was the person he defeated to become president.
Yeah,
how do they feel? What are the thoughts around that?
I gotta say, I haven't had a lot of time to gauge the pulse of the electorate. I don't think necessarily that Indians would be very disappointed in Trump's victory, because they see him as such a strong ally of Modi. And again, this is speaking with blanket terms about all Indians, which is
of course, yeah.
But at least Modi's supporters, Modi's base, see Trump as the American version of Modi, the man who's standing up for Hindu rights, this man who's fighting radical Islamic terror, which got him a lot of applause when he got both of them a lot of applause when they appeared together, saying those terms. And when for them that definitely looks like, I don't think they care that he might have defeated an Indian American to win second term. Not to mention, perhaps I think we spoke about this at our last panel, that I guess Kamala Harris, she hasn't shied away from her identity, but I don't think she's embraced it as fully as maybe some people would have liked. she didn't say I'm running to be the first Indian American president. She didn't say I'm running to be the first woman president or the first black woman who's been president. She was running as a Democrat who wanted to unite the party, unite the country, and so I guess they were shied away from that identity politics. Maybe that didn't come through to voters either.
Yeah. Samar, thank you so much for your analysis, and we're going to go back to the studio here. Thank you for being with us today.
Having me.
Here we find ourselves talking about, we've gone all over the world. We went to Mexico, Palestine, Bangladesh, and Bangladesh's most important partner, the country that surrounds Bangladesh. I often tell people something. They say, where is Bangladesh? Oh, is it part of India? What's up? I say, no. I said, if you draw the map of India, you have to draw the outline of Bangladesh. So I tell people this. It's not part of India, but the outline of Bangladesh is in the very map of India, surrounded by 2/3. Bangladesh is not largest trading partner, but most important trading partner because so much goes through it. How do you think this election affects, for both the panelists, the Indian and Bangladesh relationship, and the Bangladeshi relationship with the interim government, and the Indian relationship with whatever future government might come in Bangladesh?
I'll actually you just simmer a bit if I'm being honest.
না সত্যি আমি যদি বলি আমি আগের কথারই প্রতিধ্বনি করব যে সরকার পরিবর্তনের সাথে সাথে পলিসি পরিবর্তন হয় এতটা ইমমেচিউর দেশ এখন আর ইন্ডিয়া নাই আমেরিকা ছিল না আর আগেও কখনো বাংলাদেশের ক্ষেত্রে এটা হয় কিন্তু বাংলাদেশে যারা সরকার প্রধান থাকেন তাদের মানে আমরা আগে দেখছি আর কি তাদের হুইম তাদের ইচ্ছা অনেক সময় তাদের চিন্তা অনেক সময় তাদের শখ অনেক সময় শুনছি চীন দেশটা সুন্দর শুনছি ইন্ডিয়া দেশটা সুন্দর এই আমার আসলে ইন্ডিয়ার জন্য অনেক কিছু দরকার করা এই রকম কারণেও আসলে হয়তো অনেক কিছু চেঞ্জ হইলেও হইতে পারে পাকিস্তানের সাথে সম্পর্ক কেমন হবে চীনের সাথে সম্পর্ক কেমন হবে ইন্ডিয়ার কাছে আমরা অনেক বেশি কৃতজ্ঞ থাকবো কিনা এরকম নানাভাবে চেঞ্জ হয়েছে শেখ হাসিনা সরকার যেহেতু 15 বছর ক্ষমতায় ছিল শেখ হাসিনা সরকারও কিন্তু আপনি এরকম অনেক কিছু চেঞ্জ দেখবেন আপনি দেখেন বাংলাদেশের কোনো সরকার প্রধান কিন্তু কখনো পাকিস্তানের সরকার প্রধানের সাথে কখনো মানে গত 20, 22, 25 বছরে হ্যাঁ কখনো পাকিস্তানের সরকার প্রধানের সঙ্গে কোনো একটা ডায়ালগের ইনিশিয়েট করেন নাই কিন্তু শেখ হাসিনা আইসা কিন্তু ইমরান খানকে ফোন করছেন আপনার মনে থাকবে অন্ততপক্ষে 4-5 দিন ধরে এই পাকিস্তানের পত্রপত্রিকাগুলিতে রিপোর্ট হয়েছে আপনি দেখবেন শেখ হাসিনা কিন্তু ইন্ডিয়ার সাথে শেখ হাসিনা নিজে কইতেছে যে ইন্ডিয়ারে দেই নাই এমন কোনো কিছু নাই আবার দেখবেন এর 2 দিন পরে গিয়ে কইতেছে যে আমি সাবমেরিন কিনবো তো সাবমেরিন কিনলে এজ ইউ আউটলাইন ইট লাইক রিয়েলি গুড যে ইন্ডিয়ার ম্যাপ আঁকতে হলে বাংলাদেশকে আপনি আউটলাইন করতে হবে তাহলে আপনি সাবমেরিন আসলে কেন কিনবেন বাংলাদেশ এবং ইন্ডিয়ার যৌথ জলসীমা পাহারা দেওয়ার জন্য তো তা আপনার সাথে যে সরকারের এত খাতির তারে পাহারা দেওয়ার জন্য আপনি কিন্তু সাবমেরিন কিনতেছেন এবং সেই সাবমেরিন পরিচালনা করবে কে চীনের ক্রুরা মানে আপনি কোনো কূটনীতির বইয়ে এগুলি কথাবার্তা পাবেন এগুলি কথাবার্তা আপনি লিখবেন যে এটা মানে দিস ইজ হাউ ডিপ্লোমেসি ইন্ডিয়া সিয়াচেনে চীনের সাথে এই করতেছে আর বাংলাদেশ এই করতেছে এটা আপনি পাবেন না সো বাংলাদেশটা একটা আলাদা রাখেন আপনি কিন্তু ইন্ডিয়া আর আমেরিকা সরকার দেখা হওয়া চাই ইউনুস সাহেব তো এইটা করতে পছন্দ করে সুতরাং আসে আমরা পলিসি এরকম বানাই আচ্ছা এরপরে সরকার তো এইটা করে এইভাবে হয় না রে ভাই এভাবে হয় না আর আমেরিকার কথা আমি আবারও বলি এবং আমি ইন্ডিয়ারে মনে করি মানে ছোটদের আমেরিকা সাউথ এশিয়াতে তো ওই ছোটদের আমেরিকাও আসলে বিজনেসটাই থাকে ওর মাথায় থাকা উচিত ওর জন্য ভালো তো ও যেখানে ভালো বিজনেস করতে পারবে ও যেখানের মধ্যে থেকে ওর বাণিজ্যিক সুবিধা পাবে অর্থনৈতিক দিয়ে ও সবচেয়ে জায়গাতে যেটা পাবে সেইটাই সে করবে আর আমেরিকা তো বটেই ভাই বাংলাদেশের গুরুত্ব বাংলাদেশ অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই আমেরিকার কাছে অনেক বেশি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ কারণ কিছু জিনিসের সাথে অর্থ বাণিজ্যের কিছু সরাসরি সম্পর্ক আছে কিছু সম্পর্ক আমরা এটা কল্পনা করি ও আমেরিকা সেন্ট মার্টিন চায় তো আমেরিকা সেন্ট মার্টিন চাইয়া যা করবে আপনি ভালো করে জ্যামিতি ভূগোল টুগোল পড়লে আপনি দেখবেন এর চেয়ে স্ট্র্যাটেজিক অবস্থান অলরেডি প্যাসিফিকে এবং বঙ্গোপসাগরের ওই পাশে নিয়ে রাখছে তো এইটা এখন চীনের জন্য থ্রেট হওয়ার জন্য বা আরো অন্য কিছু করার জন্য অনেক বড় বড় বই লেখার জন্য আপনি অনেক কিছু ভাবে অনেক কিছু কইতে পারেন কিন্তু সেইটা একটা রকম
Yeah.
যখন এইটা আবার একটা কোল্ড ওয়ারের দুনিয়া ছিল, শেষ করি, কোল্ড ওয়ারের দুনিয়া যখন ছিল তখন সেই মরুলিপানাটা ছিল একরকম। এখন আমার কাছে মনে হয় না যে এইটা এরকম। আমি আবারও বলি, আমাদেরকে ওয়েট করতে হবে নতুন সরকার, মানে ট্রাম্প সরকার ক্ষমতা নিক, 20 জানুয়ারির পরে আরো 1-1.5 মাস যাক, তখন হয়তো আমরা বুঝতে পারবো।
So to summarize, Khaled bhai, you've said that basically you're not quite sure what will change immediately on a policy level. We have to wait and see, but you don't expect it to be a sea change. Not like one person comes in and the whole world, the entire relationship is redefined. And I think that's an interesting place for us to find ourselves in as we're joined by our next guest, actually. Our next guest joining us right now is is John Danilowitz, right? Is a retired U.S. diplomat who served multiple tours in Bangladesh in his 32-year career. He is currently on the board of the human rights group Right to Freedom and serves as an editor-at-large for SA Perspectives, a quarterly opinion magazine. John, thank you for joining us, and as people behind the camera will know, on very short notice. John, what do you make of the U.S. elections and how they will affect U.S.-Bangla relations?
Great. Well, obviously, it's a historic occasion having President Trump reelected for a new term. As with most political developments in the U.S., the campaign was followed very closely in Bangladesh, and particularly in the final days of the campaign when President-elect Trump issued a message on X calling for the government in Bangladesh to take steps to protect minorities. So this was, I think, a very notable development in the campaign and certainly gathered a lot of attention in Bangladesh.
And John, you spent two tours. You spent multiple tours in Bangladesh, and you've had to, of course, deal with political parties over there and listen to people's hopes, dreams, fears, ambitions, and how they want to define the relationship, how they want to define the Bangladeshi-American relationship. In your time here, which was some time ago, in your time in Bangladesh, what's one key takeaway you took from how politicians in Bangladesh wanted to be viewed in the United States?
Sure. Well, I think it's been a trend over time that people in Bangladesh, including politicians, tend to overestimate the importance of the United States and the role that the United States played. This is understandable, and it's not unique to Bangladesh, but I think that's certainly a theme, and we see that, frankly, playing out even today as various political actors in Bangladesh try to determine how President Trump's election is going to impact the situation.
It's interesting. It's a bit of I enjoy this take, right? Because in Bangladesh, there are these massive fears. What happens next? What does the American government think of us? How are they going to interact with us? But I think, at least for me, what I'm most interested in is something like a Republican government coming in right now. The last time we had a Republican president, it was Donald Trump. He slashed UN spending by, I hope I'm right by this, by about 20%. And when he slashed that spending, what happened was, in the trickle-down effect that was in Bangladesh that wasn't seen in that moment, was they just started taking fewer peacekeepers, Bangladeshi peacekeepers. And that created, I'm not going to say unrest within the army in Bangladesh, but it gave people a rise to think for the first time, oh, this affects our bottom line, this affects a job, this affects a foreign tour I can have with the UN peacekeepers. So the relationship is often not so direct, not about exactly between what Washington and Dhaka have to say to each other, but how they operate through international institutions. Would you be able to speak to how you think this Republican administration, how they will use the levers of the World Bank, the IMF, and potentially funding to the United Nations, how they will use that, and what those trickle-down effects to Bangladesh may or may not be?
Sure. Well, I think one of the challenges is always separating correlation from causation.
Sure.
And we saw that in Bangladesh over the summer when a long-standing U.S. desire to see Bangladesh's democracy flourish, to see human rights respected, was translated by many into some mythical regime change operation, which, again, I think any observer on the ground would realize is patently false. Similarly, whether it was in past administrations or the upcoming administration, the U.S. will pursue a variety of policies. I think it will be very difficult, however, to draw that straight line between those policies and effects on the ground in Bangladesh, in part because all of these developments have multiple sources of causation. There are multiple actors involved. At the end of the day, a Republican administration in the United States, as a Democratic administration, will pursue its interests. And my hope and expectation will be that the government in Bangladesh will also pursue Bangladesh's interests.
And is there a universe in which where the Bangladeshi government pursues Bangladesh's interests and it comes to a head with what the US has in mind for how it wants to engage in Bangladesh? If you could offer advice to a Bangladeshi government, what would you say? How should they handle this relationship? This relationship to, let's say, I'm going to ask a more direct question. To this interim government right now that was very cozy with the Democrats, and now they find themselves with a Republican president who 5 days ago tweeted that minorities were being repressed in Bangladesh. What advice would you offer to this interim government to build relations with this incoming Republican government?
Well, my pithy advice to this government is to keep calm and carry on. The government has announced its desire to pursue reforms leading to elections, and I see no reason why the interim government should shift from that as its focus. If you look at the history of U.S.-Bangladesh relations, there's been a remarkable bipartisan consensus and very close relations and people-to-people ties between the U.S. and Bangladesh. Obviously, there were outliers. 1971 is an outlier. I think in recent years, the Hasina government's decision to make the U.S. public enemy number one was an outlier. So I wouldn't say that the interim government's policy was necessarily driven by a relationship with a Democratic administration. In some ways, I think this was more a reversion to type. This was a return to the traditional relationship that had existed long between the United States and Bangladesh.
And earlier you brought up a very valid point about the narrative that was created in Bangladesh, that existed throughout the summer revolution in Bangladesh, that the US had their tentacles, had their claws in everything that was happening. And a big thing that kept getting mentioned over and over again, and I think it's worthwhile not to talk about it, not to fan the flames of these rumors, but it's worthwhile that this was a big narrative talking point when people spoke about a potential base in St. Martin, a potential US military base in St. Martin. Now, I say this for a reason. US military bases, there are hundreds around the world. And I'm not saying there's been any kind of evidence or proof that they would build something in St. Martin. But why do you think an idea as seductive as that, as interesting as that, got hold in Bangladesh? What were the reasons behind that becoming behind that becoming a narrative that people then believed, and they kind of believe to this day, that the United States has some interest in Bangladesh, not just for democratic reasons, they want their base over there?
Well, for many years, there's been a fundamental misunderstanding in some quarters about the nature of the U.S.-Bangladesh security relationship. Relatively innocuous efforts by the United States, for example, in the past, the desire to negotiate a humanitarian assistance agreement or an acquisition and cross-servicing agreement. These were blown into something totally out of proportion. In both cases from the U.S. side, these were technical agreements meant to facilitate our security cooperation. The U.S. wants a close relationship with Bangladesh across the boards, including seeing Bangladesh as a partner in a safe and secure and free Indo-Pacific. But there's no world in which the U.S. strategic interests are advanced by developing a military base on St. Martin's Island. So this was just a total canard that was put forward by those seeking to find some controversy in the bilateral relationship.
That's, I think that you've offered some kind of fantastic analysis over there. I'm going to end with one last question. The US-Bangladesh relationship, for whatever reason, I think whenever there's a change in government, it has to be reset. In Bangladesh, this relationship might need to be reset twice right now. Right now, with the newly elected Republican government, and maybe sometime in the next year between an elected government in Bangladesh and the Republican and Donald Trump. Do you have any advice for whoever wins the next elections in Bangladesh, how they should go about forming, not even forming these relations, the relationships exist, but how they should go about deepening them, how they should go about representing Bangladesh's needs and wants in an effective manner to the United States, because there is still the perception that we need to win something from them, that we need to show ourselves to be worthy of kind of business, of business to increase, of like for them to view us as strategically important without just India in mind. How does the next elected Bangladeshi government go about this relationship?
Sure. Well, again, I think if you look at the history of U.S.-Bangladesh relations, there have been periods of very warm positive relations between the two sides. And the credit for that goes to both Bangladeshi and American officials who worked to build this partnership. I think the most important thing for any Bangladeshi government is to understand that relations between the United States and Bangladesh are not just about government to government or chief executive to chief executive. There's an important dimension to the relationship that's people to people. The private sectors in both countries, the non-governmental sectors, the media. There are a variety of ways in which the US and Bangladesh intersect. And I think in the current environment, and a particularly important component of this relationship is the important role that the Bangladeshi diaspora in the United States can play. I think the Bangladeshi diaspora really emerged during the pro-democracy movement, particularly during this summer. And I think that vibrant and active diaspora can be a powerful force for good for both from the US and from Bangladesh.
John, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your expertise and your knowledge. It's great we hope to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Great, be happy to do that.
And,
thank you.
It's an interesting thing he talked about, he ended with talking about the Bangladeshi diaspora over here and how important it is. Khaled bhai, you've been here, you've understood the Bangladeshi diaspora, you've met people over here. How do you understand the Bangladeshi diaspora over here relating to this new US government? A relationship that is defined by what?
ইউএস গভর্নমেন্ট নিয়ে কথা বলার আগে আমি ডায়াসপোরাটা নিয়ে কথা বলি। মানে বাংলাদেশ হচ্ছে এমন একটা দেশ, দেখেন আমরা এরকম একটা আবহাওয়া, এরকম একটা মাটিতে, এরকম একটা আকাশে, এরকম একটা বৃষ্টিতে বড় হয়েছি যে এইটা বলে না, আমাদেরকে ঠাট্টা করে বলে কিন্তু যে কুয়ার ব্যাঙ যখন কুয়া থেকে বাইর হয় সঙ্গে কুয়াটাকে সঙ্গে করে নিয়ে যায়। দ্যাট ইজ সো ট্রু। আমরা যখন এইসব দেশে আসি, বিদেশে আসি, সেটা সৌদি আরব হোক, সেটা এইখানে হোক, সেটা ধরেন মাদাগাস্কার হোক, আমরা চাই যে আমাদের পেঁয়াজ মরিচ কাঁচামরিচ দিয়া ইলিশ মাছ খাইতে, আমরা আমাদের ভাত খাইতে চাই, আমরা আমাদের ঘরে আমাদের পোশাক পরে থাকতে চাই। শত বছরও এটা আমাদের মধ্যে চেঞ্জ হয় না, আসলে 3 জেনারেশন 4 জেনারেশন আমাদের চেঞ্জ হয় না, এবং আমরা এটাতে খুব প্রাউড ফিল করি। কিন্তু এমন কোনো বাঙালি নাই যে 14 এপ্রিল আসলে তার চোখ দিয়ে পানি বের হয় না, পয়লা বৈশাখ গাইতে টাইতে তার একদম অবস্থা খারাপ হয় না, 16 ডিসেম্বর 26শে মার্চ 71 এগুলি প্রত্যেকটা আমাদের মধ্যে আলাদা মানে তৈরি করে। তো সেই মানে তৈরি করবো, হ্যাঁ আমরা বিভক্ত থাকি। আমরা তো আসলে বিএনপি আওয়ামী লীগ দূরে দেন, আপনি তো ব্রাজিল আর্জেন্টিনা নিয়েও আমরা মারামারি করি আসলে যে কোথায় রয়েছে ব্রাজিল আর্জেন্টিনা জিজ্ঞেস করলে 97% বাংলাদেশের মানুষ হয়তো নাও করতে পারে, কিন্তু মারামারিটা করতে পারে এবং মুখস্থ কিন্তু 1 থেকে 30 নম্বর পর্যন্ত ব্রাজিলের রিজার্ভ বেঞ্চ, আর্জেন্টিনার রিজার্ভ বেঞ্চ। কিন্তু মুশকিলটা হলো আপনি যখন ডায়াসপোরাকে আপনি এই রকম ইলেকশন নিয়ে জানতে চাইবেন যে ট্রাম্প ভালো নাকি কমলা হ্যারিস ভালো, সেই ক্ষেত্রে আপনি এক ধরনের মিক্সড ইয়া পাবেন। কারণ আপনার কাছে কানে আসবে যে ট্রাম্প প্রেসিডেন্ট হলে সকল অবৈধ অভিবাসীরা ভাগাই দেওয়া হবে। এখন আমি নাইলে ঠিক আছি, আমার খালাতো ভাই তো ঠিক নাই, ওকে ভাগাই দিবে, আমার চাচাতো ভাই তো এখন প্রবলেমে পড়বে, আমারে তো এটার মধ্যে পড়বে, সুতরাং কমলা ভালো। আবার অন্য দিক দিয়ে যে না ও আসলে তো আমাদের বিজনেস ভালো হবে, আমরা ট্যাক্সেশনের সুবিধা পাবো, আমাদের ওগুলি করতে হবে না, সে ভালো। তো রাজনীতিটা সরাসরিভাবে আমারই কোনটা এফেক্ট করতেছে, মানে এই মূলধারা রাজনীতিটা সেইটার উপর অনেকাংশে নির্ভর করে। এছাড়া আমি যেরকম ডায়াসপোরা দেখছি, আমেরিকান ইলেকশনটা অনেকটা আমেরিকান ফুটবল খেলার মতো। আমি জানি যে এরকম একটা কিছু হয়, কিন্তু আমি এটা না পছন্দ করি, না বুঝি।
Samira, we're coming to the end of the show, and I wanted to maybe leave the last question to you. The election's over. Donald Trump is the president. We've spoken so much about the diasporic vote. We've spoken so much about all the different minorities and how they, or different minority votes, how they've worked, what hasn't worked, who they've brought into power. I want to leave you with the last word. In terms of minority rights, has anything been changed? Do you think there's like a fundamental different way that from the 6th of November onwards, we think about we no longer put the minorities into a monolith of like if you are South Asian, if you're from North Africa or South Africa or Central Africa or from any other place, that you'll kind of always lean democratic. Has that been cracked this one final time?
Absolutely. I think after 2020 elections, I believe, we realized that the Hispanic vote, that wasn't a monolith. And I think this year we're realizing that about a lot of other minority communities. And I think one of the important things to note here is what we said earlier about like it being an individualistic interest, right? Khaled bhai jeta bollen je amar chasto bhai might be affected. For a lot of people, that's actually not a priority. They're like, okay, I mean, too bad. You know, also this idea among a lot of immigrants of like, oh, I came here legally and I worked my way up and I hustled, I worked for the American dream and you didn't, right? So this like constant comparison, which is what draws the divide, or which is what I guess spreads people across the political spectrum in terms of what they believe. And I think more important than anything, we have to, instead of vilifying those who are supporting Trump, even at the cost of what it might affect their community, we have to reflect on why this is. You respond to this with anger, and the conversation ends. You have to respond with questions. You have to keep pushing, but why? But why? Or how? And not even in a condescending way. Because I think it's important to learn. Because if you think about it, minorities who voted for Trump this year, or even in 2020, they had a template. They knew what he's capable of, right? People who voted for him.
So they saw it, they learned it, and yet they still voted
and
for
they
it.
still
And they still voted for you.
And more people voted for it. So we have to think about why. What about that appeal to them?
Yeah. Thank you. And I think on that we'll bring it to a close. So today I think we've been very lucky over here. We've got perspectives from Palestine, from Mexico, from India, from Bangladesh, diasporic perspectives. I think we're left with, one major thought over here. I'd like to end with this thought, that the minorities in the United States are not a monolith. Every single group has subgroups. They all have their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. And it's less about what many people in the media, maybe myself included, what the narratives we create about them, but we should have our ear to the ground and listen to what they have to say. These minorities, these people, they count. And I think in this election, they've shown us exactly what their version of hope and change looks like. It doesn't always need to look like Barack Obama. Sometimes it looks like Donald Trump. Thank you for being with us here today.